there is something very arrogant about Christianity. There's no doubt about it, or at least there is something that would appear as arrogance, sort of confidence that is irrational. It is. Of course, it's irrational. It may be true, but it's irrationally true. I mean, the notion that the Christian has something that the non-Christian doesn't is the great mystery, is it not, of Christianity, and the paradox of it. That is that confidence that one has the truth, which is always something we should be skeptical about. Right? I mean, anybody who claims to have the truth is number one on our list of suspects of frauds, and that's part of Christianity is dealing with being in the position of thinking that you have the truth. It's a very uncomfortable position, really. And for a philosopher to be a Christian philosopher is to be aware of that arrogance, because to be a philosopher on some level is to be a pagan, insofar as one loves the pagan thinkers, and here obviously Plato and Aristotle. I mean, to be a Christian is almost to be embarrassingly privileged, in the sense that one can say that one has a truth that Plato didn't. I mean, very few people in philosophy are going to say that out loud. The Christian, in a way, has to face that, and so we get remarks like, I'm thinking specifically of what he says on page 215. He's been talking about Plato and Plato's doctrine of immortality, and we'll be reading that. We'll be reading the Phaedo. I mean, a very important part, reading it hopefully very thoroughly, and looking at Plato's arguments, Socrates' arguments in that fantastic dialogue. And of course, Landsberg has great respect for Plato. What philosopher doesn't have great respect for Plato? But he, as a Christian, he has to say, well, Plato missed it. Because what else are you going to say as a Christian? That Plato, he was cool, he had everything I had? No, if he wasn't a Christian, he was missing something of vital importance. So referring to Plato, he says on page 215, his limitations are the limitations of all pre-Christian philosophy in Europe. The person was not yet disclosed, and the sense of death remained hidden. The person was not yet disclosed. Maybe it's, this is why St. Augustine, is so important to this, and that section on Augustine, which I'm not going to talk about because it doesn't really need any kind of help. I think to read it with entire clarity. Augustine is often pointed to as the first true personality, the individual, the self-aware sort of individual of the modern type in Western literature. And what Landsberg is saying is that the person, the notion of the unique individual self, had not yet been discovered by Plato and his contemporaries. It needed Christianity to bring that into existence, the unique individual. What's the relevance to the subject at hand, though? Well, he's been talking about immortality and the great advance upon the Christian idea of life after death. It's life after death. That is, it's not human life, but it's the life of the individual, or it's the persistence of the unique individual, of the unique spirit in communion with others, in communion with God. It's not the idea of that there's a part of the self which cannot die, which one may say is sort of like the Hindu idea, as I understand it, just from basically reading and teaching the Bhagavad Gita for a number of years. And looking at Plato, that is, there's a part of the self that cannot die and will persist, but it's not thought of as being part of our personality, our unique individuality that persists. It's this generic, sort of ideal, eternal part of us, which really can't change, has no individuality except, insofar as it's part of being itself. That it took Christianity to really conceptualize the idea of the individual persisting. But that is the structure of hope, right? That is the content of hope described in the last section. The content of hope is not that something will survive, but that I will survive. I in the fullness of my individual personality. So what is this section 7, the forms of experience of death? It is really looking at the notions of immortality that exist in non-Christian philosophy. Looking at Plato, looking at Epicurus. Look at the beginning of it, section 7, forms of experience of death. The general outline of the attitude of the human person towards the problem of death, as we have tried to define it, shows that the sense of our mortality, which derives from the experience of death, naturally acquires a very different meaning according to the manner in which we formulate the dependence or independence of personal life on bodily life. Again, that's the key turning point back in the earlier section on the death of the other, experience of the death of the other, seem to be the decisions we make about the ramifications of that moment where we realize the connectedness of the death of the, from the death of the body, we realize the connectedness of the body with personality. And here he's acknowledging that there are different manners in which we formulate the dependence or independence of personal life on bodily life. Again, from his point of view, if we decide at that moment that it's a totally dependent relationship, that is the person, the expression of the person needs the body in order to be real, that's a relation of dependence, and that is hopelessness and despair. The independence of personal life on bodily life would mean that we believe in the fundamental structure of our being, which is hope. That is not a totally dependent relationship. But a recognition that, many people have, well, that other attitude is fully legitimate in the sense that it's coherent. He says about anguish, the anguish of death. He says it is the horror of the person at the prospect of metaphysical abandonment, being left, tossed away by death. An abandonment which is already present in an anticipation of the end of corporeal existence. The prison house. And here he's referring to the famous idea from the Phaedo, again, which we'll read, that the body is the prison house of the soul. It's the jail of the soul. It's where the soul has been captured and wants to be released. The prison house was also a shelter. It might have been a prison, but it was some place to live. Man has no confidence in his powers of resistance to isolation, and thus he is, as it were, annihilated in anticipation. But then he goes on to say, death as an absolute end is an empty concept, which we do not experience, even in the anguish of death. It's pretty important, too. It seems like that death as an absolute end is an empty concept. We never actually experience that. That is, we never really fully have that experience, the content of death as the absolute end. We do not experience nothingness, we experience being, and the hope is for the continuation and fulfillment of being. And section 7 is really both a critique of Plato's doctrine of immortality in favor of a Christian view of immortality, and also a critique of thinkers like Epicurus and associated thinkers like the Stoics, who thought a lot about death, thought a lot about the significance of death and the need to overcome our fears of death, but again, in an acceptance of death. And we'll have plenty of time to talk about Plato, so there's no need to go over that now. The one thing I would like to, just as we wrap this up, to refer to is to his mention of Epicurus at the bottom of page 215. And, I want to defend Epicurus against this. I think it's necessary, but also to see how Landsberg's attitudes reflect on the first thing that we read for this class. On page 215 again, it says, Epicurus is the originator of a doctrine which has been repeated and discussed at infinite length. It might be called the sophism of the inexistence of death. The sophism of the inexistence of death. Death is nothing to us, death is not real, death is not an experience of life, therefore it is nothing to us. He calls this the sophism of the inexistence of death. Death is nothing. Well, what is a sophism? There's about a million ways to go at that, but he gives himself a little bit later a very good definition of it from one point of view. It says on page 216, the conclusion remains a sophism and is only a formula of escape. It endeavors to disprove verbally something from which man cannot escape in reality. That's a pretty good definition of what sophism is. An attempt to prove in words, to prove in words something that couldn't possibly be proved for real. To disprove verbally something that is inescapable in reality. The inescapability, the thing that can't be escaped there is, of course, death. And his view of Epicurus is that Epicurus verbally dismisses something which cannot be dismissed in reality, and that is the experience of death as an actual experience of life, paradoxically. That is, the experience of death is, in fact, necessary. It is a necessary experience that all of us will go through, have to go through, and our task is to transform death spiritually, to appropriate death spiritually, to view death. And again, this is heavily reliant on Christian theology and a whole Christian way of thinking, but to appropriate death as the beginning and not the end, as a spiritual transformation, not an existential annihilation. So if that's the final answer, I'm not sure about the specific question of where we derive our notions of the necessity of death, that is a necessary task and challenge, this spiritual appropriation that we must go through. I don't know if that's the greatest interpretation of what Landsberg is getting at in a particular question or not.